This is an update of a talk I gave here in 2006. And so if it sounds familiar to some of you, please bear with me. It has changed, but unfortunately, some of the facts do remain the same. My remarks today deal with the afterlife, the hereafter, and the religious struggles that surrounded this and other issues during Shakespeare's time, and which might well have contributed to the writing of Hamlet. Now, most Unitarian Universalists don't spend too much time worrying about the afterlife. Our Universalist heritage assures us that wherever we go when we die will be the same for everyone, and most of us concern ourselves with the heaven and hell we create in this world rather than the next. However, after all these years, we continue to hear about suicide bombers who wreak the havoc they wreak for blessings in the afterlife. But today I want to talk about 16th century England, religious struggle, and Hamlet. Now, how many of you are familiar with Hamlet? And just familiar, just very good. It is, of course, Shakespeare's famous, longest, most complicated, and most quoted play. You heard, of course, about the man who went to see Hamlet. He liked it fine, thought it was a good play and all, but felt it contained too many quotations. You got it. As you are probably aware, we know very little about Shakespeare. The little we do know that he was born to John and Mary Shakespeare at Stratford-on-Avon. John was a prosperous glove maker, also a prominent citizen involved in local politics, and for a while was mayor of Stratford. Elizabeth I was on the throne, of course, and since she was a Protestant, the whole country had to be Protestant. Church attendance was compulsory, and you were fined for an absence. One can imagine John and family, dressed in their Sunday best, probably with their own special pew, processing into church on Sunday mornings to sit through a very long and pedantic sermon with nothing for the children. Religious education came a couple of centuries later. And it was clear from his works that William had little time for organized religion. He did, in all probability, have time for school. We assume, nothing is definite, that he attended the local grammar school, and while the syllabus was limited, it was rigorous, with a major focus on Latin, and since our Will was no doubt a very bright student, he did very well. There is no question that he was headed for university, but by the time he was 13, something happened. John Shakespeare's business went south, and he lost all his money. So Will was needed to be a wage earner. How John lost all his money is much of a mystery, as is this whole family. There could have been several reasons, but one is based in religious struggles, and that's the one I'd like to address this morning, and to understand that, we need a little history lesson. So this is where you come in. If I say Henry VIII, what's the first thing you think of? All those wives. I knew you wouldn't let me down. All those wives. The original desperate housewives. Well, we're only interested in the first three. Now, what else? I'm hearing it, I think. He founded the Anglican Church, not the Protestant Church, the Anglican Church. Now, did that have anything to do with those wives? Yes. And the third thing we remember him for was the dissolution of monasteries, which was a black mark for Henry and a black moment in English history. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was a Spanish princess, and Henry was married after her when he was young. However, she produced no sons, just one measly daughter, Mary. So when she was in her late 30s and beyond childbearing age, Henry decided to get rid of her. added to which he'd fallen in love with somebody else by the name of Anne Boleyn, who looked like a bearer of sons. He was wrong there. So he asked the Pope for annulment, which the Pope refused. There being more than one way to solve this problem, he broke with Rome, divorced Catherine, and married Anne. This turned out not to be a marriage in heaven, and before long, Anne lost her head, but not before giving birth to yet another daughter, who was Elizabeth, I tell you. Now, since you all did so well with Bloodthirsty this morning, I thought you might be interested in a bit of trivia about Anne's beheading. She was told to pile her hair on top of her head so that the executioner would have easier access to her neck. She ascended the scaffold. She forgave the executioner. And then she was to kneel, say her prayers, and then put her head on the block. Well, the executioner was a little overzealous, and while she was kneeling at her prayers, he took her head off with one stroke. So she never did put her head on the block. The third wife, Jane Seymour, did give him the long-awaited son, but he turned out to be sickly. However, since Jane died in childbirth, the only 3 children Henry had were Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. So who succeeded Henry? Ooh. Edward. Why Edward? He's a boy. Okay. He was the youngest, but he was a boy, and he wasn't well, but nevertheless he got the nod. Now, Henry's Anglican church had been Anglican in name only. Henry wasn't very interested in religion and simply substituted the name king for pope, otherwise the liturgy remained the same. Edward was only 8 when he came to the throne, and his advisors were devout Protestants. Now, we don't usually think of 8-year-olds as being interested in how a country could be run, but Edward was not your typical 8-year-old. From the age of 6, he learned French, Spanish, Italian, geometry, music, religion, and finance, along, no doubt, with kingdom management, none of which was available on Facebook. He did have other young fellows studying with him. There was a rotating group, and he would have one study partner at a time. And the reason for that is that if Edward made a mistake in his lessons and therefore was due for a beating, you were not allowed to lay a hand on the heir to the throne, let alone the king himself. So the person who got the beating was the other student, and hence the expression whipping boy. So Edward set to work making religion accessible, both by a plainer church interior, by having services in English, and by introducing the Book of Common Prayer, so those who could read could know what was going on. This was a major, major breakthrough, and one that not everybody liked. Well, Edward didn't live very long. He got sick and died, and on his death he was succeeded by Mary, Bloody Mary, who was a Catholic. Mary hated Protestants for good reason. She and her mother had been heartily humiliated by Henry and his ilk over the divorce. It was terrible. So all of England was Catholic again. And in her 5-year reign, she burned 300 Protestants at the stake. When she died, largely unlamented, who came next? Elizabeth, Gloriana herself, who along with Edward had been brought up Protestant. So the English thought, here we go again, back to being Protestant, all of us. But not so fast. Elizabeth was a moderate, and in some ways ahead of her time. She realized that people couldn't turn their faith on and off like a faucet, and in fact, the title of my sermon today is Elizabeth's own words. which I think are very beautiful. We do not make windows into men's souls. Isn't that lovely? In other words, yes, we were all Protestants. And we all had to go to church. Don't forget that, fine. But if in your heart you were a Catholic, if you had a rosary or two around the house, that was okay. Just don't let anyone know about it. And that worked all right until 1571, when Will Shakespeare was 7. Yes, we're getting back to him in a minute. The Pope let it be known that English Catholics were not duty-bound to obey Elizabeth, and that the Vatican might just look the other way if something happened to her. Well, that really put the cat among the pigeons, and it was no longer safe to harbour Catholic sympathies, not even in your soul. And there was, in fact, a witch hunt on Catholics, another horrible one, in which John Shakespeare, being a local leading citizen, had to take part. So what does all this have to do with Shakespeare and the reversal of John's fortunes? We have since learnt from evidence discovered and authenticated that John Shakespeare was and always had been a devout Catholic who had suppressed his beliefs to support his ambition. For years, he had kept quiet about who he was and what he believed, had participated in all the unpleasant goings-on, and finally could do it no more. So how did this affect John? He appears to have sunk into depression, become a very heavy drinker, though in those days I don't know how you could tell the difference, which affected his business and his relationships. So the thing he wanted most in the world, material success, the respect of the townspeople, the best for his children, was suddenly the last thing he got. And this, of course, had a major impact on his son, William. Assuming this to be true, and I say assuming, much of this is speculation, he would have withdrawn into himself. And here we have the genesis of Hamlet, which is the first play ever written to deal with an individual's inward struggle, rather than the external struggle between good and evil, which is what passed for tragedy until then. So Will left school at 15 for the next 10 years. We don't know what he did, but he turned up in London in 1589, joined the Queen's Men, and began writing plays, although he didn't write Hamlet until 1600. So what's Hamlet about, apart from all those quotations? Hamlet is about death. Not just because a lot of people die in it, they do, but what happens to us after we die. The importance of being buried in hallowed ground, why we don't commit suicide when the world gets too rough for us, as was mentioned in the chalice lighting this morning. In other words, questions about the afterlife. Hamlet is a young Danish prince who learns while at university that his father, the king, has died, supposedly having been bitten by a snake while taking a nap. Once back home in Denmark, he discovers to his horror that his mother has already married again, before he'd even got there, and to his uncle yet, a man he despises. The haste of the marriage and the strong dislike of his new stepfather plunge Hamlet into depression, a depression with which Shakespeare would have been very familiar. He said, oh, that this too solid flesh would melt, thaw, and resolve itself into a dew. Clearly a very unhappy camper. He then learns what? That his father did not die of natural causes, but had been murdered by this uncle. And how does he learn this? From his father's ghost, who appeared to him on the battlements. Everybody with me so far? And to understand the enormity of this revelation, we need to look into this story a little closer. The Catholic view of the afterlife, in other words, what Henry believed until he switched sides, and which Mary believed and which Shakespeare would have grown up with, living in the home where he did, was that while saints went to heaven and sinners to hell, there was a middle ground known as purgatory, where most people went after they died. Purgatory was a horrible place, where you suffered the tortures of the damned, much like hell, but there was an out. After sufficient penances, you could get promoted to heaven. And this process could be helped along by those on earth, those left behind, by going to the churches or the monasteries and offering money, jewels, or gold plate. A relative could get the priest to intercede for you with God. Remember, only the priests and God spoke Latin. And that would help you move up the ladder towards heaven. And presumably, the more a person gave, the greater the intercession. Well, this, of course, enabled the monasteries to become very rich and was known as the sale of indulgences, which was, of course, something Martin Luther had inveighed against at Wittenberg, and Henry VIII had joined in, denouncing it as a racket and a scam. No doubt it was, although Henry's motives had more to do with getting his hands on said wealth rather than disposing of scams. However, once the Protestants took over, Edward and Elizabeth, their view was while there were most certainly such places as heaven and hell, there was no such place as purgatory. And yes, there might be ghosts. But if you saw a ghost, you could be sure it was an evil spirit impersonating your dear departed, whose goal was to urge you to do something evil that would end you up in hell. And then there was the third approach, a new approach, which was the rational, intellectual, and scholarly approach, which was just coming into awareness among educated people. Yes, there was a heaven and hell, but no such things as ghosts. And if you saw something, it was just that. You were seeing things. So back to the play and the ghost. The guys who see the ghost first, Bernardo, Marcellus, and Horatio, great Danish names, are Protestants, as would be most of Shakespeare's audience, and are convinced that the apparition they see is evil. Yes, it's a ghost, but it's evil. They are, however, duty-bound to report it to Hamlet. And remember, until he dropped out, Hamlet was a student at the University of Wittenberg. In fact, he's the only character in the whole of Shakespeare whose educational background we know. And what was Wittenberg famous for? Martin Luther and the... Good. Wittenberg was also famous for offering a rational approach to life. So Shakespeare's position on the afterlife from his education would be, so Hamlet's position on the afterlife would be the rational one. However, when he sees that ghost of his father, incontrovertible evidence that he is seeing the real thing, he leapfrogs immediately to the Catholic view of his boyhood, and when his father asks him to avenge his murder, because that is what it was, he agrees on the spot. And might not we all? However, in the cold light of day, he begins to wonder whether what he had seen was indeed good old Dad, or might it not have been the result of an overactive imagination, an undigested piece of beef? A lot of what ifs. What if he killed his uncle and it turned out the ghost was mistaken or lying? What if this was a plot? What if he was imagining the whole thing because he hated his uncle so? Hence the indecision. An indecision which has given us some of the greatest poetry ever written, and an indecision that I think we could all relate to. Indeed, when we see Hamlet, we should relate to that, and therein lies its greatness. Not only was Shakespeare writing about the religious identity crisis he had witnessed in his own life, but to his audience he was reflecting the religious struggle of the country. 1 minute Catholic, the next Protestant. 1 minute tolerant, the next intolerant. 1 minute seeing religion as mystery interpretable only by priests, and the next down to earth and accessible with a God we could all talk to. 1 minute people who had witnessed visions were heralded, the next they were told to get help. And on and on. And the genius of Shakespeare and the brilliance of the play rest in the fact that this whole struggle the country had faced was compacted into a few short scenes about a ghost. So you say, this is all very interesting. What does it have to do with me? It all happened over 400 years ago, and these days our leaders don't dictate our beliefs. Our Constitution protects against that, and I hope you're right. But I would remind you that we have a Supreme Court justice who has used his particular definition of Christianity to uphold the death penalty. We have an elected judge of a major state who defends his right to erect a monument of the 10 Commandments outside his courthouse. We have a body of elected officials who try to impose their religious views to amend the Constitution and take away basic human rights, and a legislature in a major state which is determined to impose its will to take away a woman's right to make decisions about her own body. So before we get too complacent, let me put to you the question: might we not be making windows into men's and women's souls? Amen and blessed be.